Professor, religion is merely a psychological crutch for the weak. Science has proven that the universe can exist without a divine creator. There is no logical reason to believe in God. Barron. Professor, may I ask you a question? Professor. Of course. Go ahead. Barron. You say there is no logical reason to believe in God, but tell me, do you believe in justice? Professor. Justice? Of course I do. Barron. Can you see justice? Can you touch it? Can you measure it under a microscope? Professor. Well, no. But justice is a concept. It exists in human society. Barron. Exactly. Just because something cannot be physically seen or measured does not mean it doesn't exist. Love, morality, and even logic itself are intangible. Yet we know they are real. Why, then, should we dismiss the existence of God simply because he cannot be observed? In a laboratory, Professor? That's a clever argument, but science relies on empirical evidence. Barron. Science explains how things work, but it doesn't explain why they exist in the first place. The universe operates under precise laws: gravity, thermodynamics, mathematics. Where did these laws come from? If there was no intelligence behind them, why do they exist at all? Professor. That's a philosophical question, not a scientific one. Barron. Exactly. Which is why dismissing God using only scientific methods is incomplete. Science and faith are not enemies. They answer different questions. Science tells us how the universe works, but faith gives us meaning and purpose. Professor. Interesting perspective, young man. Barron. Thank you, Professor. I just believe that truth is bigger than what we can see under a microscope. I'm Professor, smiling thoughtfully. You raise some intriguing points, Barron. But faith has led people to believe in many different gods and religions throughout history. How do you determine which one, if any, is true? Barron. That's a fair question, Professor. Throughout history, people have sought answers about life, purpose, and morality. The fact that so many civilizations have believed in a higher power suggests that there is something innate in humanity that seeks the divine. Professor. Or it could simply be a way to explain the unknown. Barron. Perhaps. But then why does this search for meaning persist even as science advances? If science alone could satisfy the human heart, then why do so many people, scientists included, still believe in God? Professor. Maybe it's tradition or psychological comfort. Barron. But if belief in God were only a psychological crutch, why do people throughout history willingly suffer and even die for their faith? Surely, if it were just about comfort, they would abandon it when faced with persecution. Professor. Pauses. That is an interesting point. Barron. Faith is not about avoiding hard questions, it's about seeking truth. And truth isn't limited to what we can see or measure. Even scientific theories start with assumptions, things we accept as true without direct proof. In the same way, belief in God is a reasoned conclusion based on evidence, experience, and the search for meaning. Professor. Nods. You've given me something to think about, Barron. Barron, smiling. That's all I ask, Professor. Professor, leaning back in his chair. Barron, you've certainly presented a well-thought-out argument. But let me ask you this. If God exists, why is there so much suffering in the world? Surely, an all-powerful, all-loving God would prevent pain and injustice. Barron. That's one of the hardest questions anyone can ask. And I won't pretend there's an easy answer. But let's start with this. Does the existence of suffering automatically mean that God doesn't exist? Professor: well, it certainly makes it harder to believe in an all-loving deity. Barron: I understand that. But let's think about justice again. You believe in justice, yet you acknowledge that injustice exists. Does the existence of injustice mean justice is an illusion? Professor: no. It means justice is something we strive for, despite the presence of injustice. Barron: exactly. And in the same way, suffering doesn't mean God isn't real. It means something is broken in the world. The question is, why is it broken? Professor: that brings us back to religious explanations, I assume? Barron: not just religious, philosophical, too. Many faiths, including Christianity, teach that free will plays a key role. Love and goodness are only meaningful if they are freely chosen. If God forced us to do good and prevented all suffering, we would be robots, not people. Our choices, including bad ones, have consequences. Professor nods slowly. I see. But that still doesn't explain natural disasters, diseases, and suffering that isn't caused by human choices. Barron: true. And that's where faith and trust in God come in. If we accept the idea of a higher purpose beyond this life, then suffering can have meaning, even if we don't fully understand it now. Many people, in their deepest suffering, find a strength and peace they never knew before. Even science acknowledges that struggle often leads to growth. The same could be true spiritually. Professor pauses in thought. So you're saying that suffering isn't necessarily proof against God? It could be part of a larger reality we don't fully grasp? Barron: yes. And if that's even possible, then dismissing God outright would be premature. Just as science continues to explore the mysteries of the universe, faith seeks to understand the deeper purpose behind our existence. Maybe both are needed to see the full picture. Professor, smiling faintly: you argue well, Barron. I may not agree with everything, but I respect your reasoning. Barron, smiling back: that's all I ask, Professor. Truth should always be pursued with an open mind. Professor, chuckling slightly: you certainly have a way with words, Barron. But let's take this a step further. You argue that science and faith answer different questions, but what about the contradictions between them? For instance, religious texts describe miracles, events that defy natural laws. Science, on the other hand, is based on the consistency of those laws. How can a rational person believe in miracles? Barron, that's a great question, Professor. I'd start by asking, do you believe in the possibility of things we don't yet understand? Professor, of course. Science is constantly discovering new things. Barron, exactly. What people once considered impossible, like communicating instantly across the globe or traveling to space, became reality with greater knowledge. Now, miracles are often dismissed because they don't fit into what we currently understand. But if God exists, isn't it reasonable to think that he could operate beyond the natural laws we observe? Professor raises an eyebrow. So you're saying miracles aren't violations of natural law, but actions from a higher reality we don't fully grasp? Barron, precisely. If natural laws describe how the universe normally functions, then miracles would be moments where something beyond nature intervenes. They don't contradict science any more than a software developer editing code contradicts the program's normal function. It's an external intelligence making an intentional change. Professor pauses thoughtfully. That's an interesting analogy, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If miracles truly happen, where's the proof? Barron, that depends on what kind of proof you're looking for. Many people throughout history have claimed to witness miracles, unexplained healings, near-death experiences, even scientific studies on cases of spontaneous recovery that doctors can't explain. While skeptics argue these could be coincidences or psychological phenomena, that doesn't mean all miraculous claims are false. Professor, but personal testimony isn't the same as empirical evidence. Barron, that's true, but not all truth is found in a laboratory. Think about history. How do we know Julius Caesar existed? We can't run experiments to verify his life, but we trust historical records. Similarly, many religious traditions, including Christianity, claim historical miracles witnessed by multiple people. Dismissing them outright because they don't fit our current framework of understanding isn't scientific. It's a philosophical choice. Professor, leaning forward. So you're saying an open-minded scientist shouldn't dismiss miracles outright, but should examine them critically, just like any other claim? Barron, nodding. Yes, just as science keeps an open mind about new discoveries, shouldn't we be open to the possibility of realities beyond our immediate comprehension? Professor, sitting back with a thoughtful smile. Barron, you've given me much to. Professor, chuckling. You're relentless, Barron. But let's not stop now. Since we're discussing truth, let me ask you this. Why should we believe in one religion over another? Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism all claim to offer truth. How do you determine which one, if any, is correct? Barron, that's a crucial question, Professor. If there's truth in religion, then it's important to find the one that best aligns with reality. Would you agree? Professor nods. Go on. Barron, one way to examine religions is by their central claims. Some religions are primarily philosophical, focusing on human wisdom and self-improvement. Others, like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, make historical claims about real events, real people, and divine intervention in history. If a religion makes a historical claim, it can be investigated like any other historical event. Professor, so you're suggesting we test religious claims the way historians test events? Barron, exactly. For example, Christianity stands or falls on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. If Jesus didn't exist, or if he wasn't resurrected, then Christianity collapses. But if the resurrection did happen, then it's the most important event in history. Professor pauses. But the resurrection is based on ancient texts. How can we verify something from 2,000 years ago? Barron, that's a fair concern, but historians don't reject an event just because it's old. They look at evidence, eyewitness, accounts, manuscript reliability, external corroboration, and the impact of the event. And when it comes to the resurrection, we have multiple early sources, written within the lifetimes of witnesses, that describe Jesus' death and resurrection. Even skeptical scholars acknowledge that something extraordinary happened. Professor, leaning forward, you're saying the resurrection isn't just a matter of faith, but also a matter of historical investigation? Barron, yes, of course, faith plays a role, but Christianity isn't based on blind faith, it's based on evidence. If Jesus truly rose from the dead, then that validates his claims about God, life, and salvation. That's why Christianity is unique. It doesn't just offer moral teachings, it makes a testable claim about a Barron. If Christianity isn't true, I wouldn't want to believe in it. But if it is, then it has serious implications for all of us. That's why the question of truth is so important. Professor nods slowly. I appreciate your honesty, but let me challenge you further. What about morality? Some argue that we don't need God to be moral. Human societies have developed moral codes without religion. So why do we need faith for morality? Barron, that's a great question. People can certainly behave morally without believing in God. But the deeper issue is this. Where does morality come from? Is it just a social construct, or is there an objective standard? Professor, some would say morality evolved to help societies function. We developed it as a survival mechanism. Barron, that's one explanation. But if morality is just an evolutionary adaptation, then it isn't truly objective. It's just a byproduct of survival. That would mean concepts like justice, human rights, and dignity aren't actually real. They're just useful illusions. Professor raises an eyebrow. Are you saying morality is meaningless without God? Barron, not meaningless. But if there's no higher moral lawgiver, then morality is just a matter of opinion. One culture might value kindness. Another might value conquest. Without an objective standard, who's to say which is right? But if morality is real, if things like murder and oppression are truly wrong, regardless of opinion, then we need a foundation beyond human preference. Professor pauses. You're suggesting that if objective morality exists, then it points to a moral lawgiver, God? Barron, exactly. We don't invent morality, we discover it. Just like we don't invent mathematical truths, we recognize them. And if morality is real and binding, then it points to something, or someone, beyond us. Professor, leaning back with a thoughtful expression. Barron, I must say, you've given me a lot to think about. Barron, smiling. That's all I hope for, Professor. Seeking truth means being willing to ask the hard questions. Professor, smirking slightly. Well, you've certainly done that. I may not be convinced yet, but I respect your reasoning. Barron, and I respect yours, Professor. The pursuit of truth is what matters most. The bell rings, signaling the end of class. The professor gathers his notes, still deep in thought. As students rise from their seats, Barron walks to the door, turning back one last time. Professor, calling out, Barron, I'll be expecting more debates like this in the future. Barron, grinning, looking forward to it, Professor. With that, Barron exits the classroom, leaving behind an atmosphere of curiosity and contemplation. The conversation isn't over. It's only just begun. As Barron steps out into the hallway, a few students approach him, intrigued by the discussion. Student 1, smiling. That was an interesting debate, Barron. You really held your own against the professor. Student 2 nods. Yeah, I've never thought about faith and science working together like that. Barron chuckles. I'm just glad it got people thinking. Truth is worth exploring, no matter where it leads. The professor watches from his desk, deep in thought. He glances at the notes he had prepared for class, then at the empty doorway where Barron had just left. A small smile crosses his face as he mutters to himself, Professor, perhaps the discussion isn't over after all. The classroom empties, But the conversation lingers. Questions, ideas, and the search for truth continue beyond the walls of academia. Some debates never truly end. They simply inspire new journeys of thought, discovery, and faith. The end.